Okay, I have Bradford's history open. Um, it's called Of Plymouth Plantation. It's the journal that he wrote, 270 pages worth. Of course, we're not reading 270 pages, we're reading a small excerpt. So I have the history open, and I also have the quiz open at the same time. So let's see what we have in terms of quiz questions. During the voyage, where does Bradford see signs that God is directing the history of the pilgrims? Be sure to use the ICE method with a quote. So hopefully I'll point out a couple of quotes to you, and you can use some of these quotes in your answer. Use a quote. Let's look at the second question. What examples did Bradford use to illustrate the perils of the journey? So it looks like we're talking about um, the journey being difficult. So let's see if we can find something in the reading. From Plymouth Plantation, of their voyage and how they passed the sea, and of their safe arrival at Cape Cod. Now remember, the language is going to be sort of old-fashioned because it was written in 16 something. All right, so just put up with it and just try to understand what he's saying. September 6th. These troubles being blown over and now all being compact together in one ship, they put to sea again with a prosperous wind, which continued divers days together, which was some encouragement unto them. Yet, according to their usual manner, many were afflicted with seasickness. Okay, so apparently they got on a boat, all of them, and they're getting seasick. And I may not omit here a special work of God's providence. There was a proud and very profane young man. Oh, here's an interference of God. This could potentially be one of your quotes. All right, let's see what it says. There was a proud and very profane young man, one of the seamen, of a very lusty, able body, which made him the more haughty. He would always be condemning the poor people in their sickness and cursing them daily with grievous excoriations. It did not let to tell them that he hoped to help to cast half of them overboard before they came to their journey's end, and to make merry with what they had. And if he were with by any gentle reproofs, he would curse and swear most bitterly. But it pleases God, before they came half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first that was thrown overboard. Thus his curse is light on his own head, and it was an astonishment to all his fellows, for they noted it to be just the hand of God upon him. So there's an example. God took care of a guy that was swearing at them and mistreating them. After they had enjoyed fair winds and a weather for a season, they were encountered many times with crosswinds, and met with many fierce storms, with which the ship was shroudly shaken, and her upper works made very leaky, and one of the main beams in the midships was bowed and cracked, which put them in such fear that the ship could not be. Okay, so apparently the storms were really shaking the ship, and one of the major beams in the boat was broken, and it was leaking a bit, able to perform the voyage. So some of the chief of the company, perceiving the mariners to fear the sufficiency of the ship as it appeared by their mutterings, they entered into serious consultation with the master and other officers of the ship, to consider in time the time of danger, and rather to return than to cast themselves into a desperate and inevitable peril. So they wanted to turn back. They were worried. And truly, there was great distraction and difference of opinion amongst the mariners themselves. Fain would they do what could be done for their wages' sake, being now near half the seas over, and on the other hand, they were loath to hazard their lives too desperately. So they weren't sure whether it was worth it to make the money, because they might die. But in examining all of the opinions, the master and the others affirmed that they knew the ship to be strong and firm under water, and for the buckling of the main beam there was a great iron screw the passengers brought out of Holland, which would raise the beam into his place, in which being done, the carpenter and master affirmed that with a post put under it, set firm in the lower deck, and otherwise bound, he would make it sufficient. And as for the decks and upper works, they would caulk them as well as they could, and though with the working of the ship they would not keep long staunch, yet there would otherwise be no great danger if they did not overpress her with sails. So they committed themselves to the will of God, and resolved to proceed. So apparently they fixed the beam as best they could, and they caulked up the cracks to keep the water out and decided to go on. In sundry of these storms the winds were so fierce and the sea so high as they could not bear a knot of sail, but were forced to hull for divers days together. And in one of them, as they thus lay at Hull in a mighty storm, a lusty young man called John Howland, coming upon some occasion above the gratings. All right, so they were forced in a storm to just lash all their ships together and just sit there because it was too windy. Was with a seal of the ship thrown into the sea, but it pleased God that he caught hold of the topsail halyards which hung overboard and ran out at length, yet he held his hold, though he was sundry fathoms under water, till he was hauled up by the same rope to the brim of the water, and then with a great boat hook and other means got into the ship again, and his life saved. And though he was something ill with it, yet he lived many years after and became a profitable member both in the church and commonwealth. In all this voyage there died but one of the passengers, which was William Boughton, a youth servant to Samuel Fuller, when they drew near the coast. So there's another example of God saving this guy who fell overboard. He grabbed onto a rope and they pulled him in. But to omit other things that I may be brief, after long beating at sea, they fell with that land which is called Cape Cod. It's not pushing over. There it goes. The which being made and certainly known to be it, they were not a little joyful. After some deliberation and amongst themselves and with the master of the ship, they tacked about and resolved to stand for the southward, the wind and weather being fair, to find some place about Hudson's River for their habitation. But after they had sailed that course about half a day, they fell among dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and they were so far entangled therein that they conceived themselves in great danger, and the wind shrinking upon them withal, they resolved to bear up again for the Cape, and thought themselves happy to get out of dangers before the night overtook them, as by God's good providence. Okay, so here comes God again. So what happened? They saw land, and they went up the coast looking for a place to pull in, and they couldn't find one, and they turned around and they came back down the coast looking for a place to pull in. And eventually they land, I think it's on the outside of Cape Cod, although my history is not perfect. I think they landed on the outside of Cape Cod, even though eventually they moved into the bay, maybe a year later. Okay, so we have quotes showing signs that God is directing them. And we also have examples of Bradford illustrating the perils of the journey. We have plenty of storms, and they had to, watch out for falling overboard. Okay, let's go on to the next question. What difficulties did the first settlers encounter from nature? And what evidence does Bradford use to attribute their survival to God? All right, so we have God intervening again because they're going to have some problems with nature. And let's do one more question. What episode during that first desperate winter illustrates the Puritans' concern for each other? Okay, so they take care of each other. So let's see if we can find these things. They did. And the next day they got into Cape Harbor, where they rid in safety. Okay. Being thus arrived in good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. But here I cannot but stay and make pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. And so I think will the reader will too, when he well considers the same. Okay, so he's going to say the condition of the people after they went across the ocean for so long. Being thus past the vast ocean and at sea troubles before their preparation, as may be remembered by that which went before, they were now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses, or much less towns to repair to seek to for succor. It's recorded in the scripture as mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked company that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them, but these savage barbarians, where they met with them, as after will appear, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for the season, it was winter. And they know that know the winters of that country, know them to be sharp and violent and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangerous to travel to known places, much more to seek an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men, and what multitudes there might be of them they knew not, neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Sigah, which apparently is in the Bible, to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes, for which way sooner they turn their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect. I'm going to turn the page in a second, but they arrived at this new land, and there was no place to hide. There were no houses. They were cold. They weren't fed. They had no place to hide, and there was just wilderness. And the natives were there, and the natives apparently wanted to fill them full of arrows of any outward objects. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country full of woods and thickets represented a wild and savage hue. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean, which they had passed, and now is a main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. If it be said they had a ship to succor them, it is true. But what heard they daily from the master and the company? But that with speed they should look out a place with their shallop, and where they would be at some near distance, for the season was such as he would not stir from thence till a safe harbor was discovered by them, where they would be, and he might go without danger, and that victuals consumed apace, but he must and would keep sufficient for themselves in their return. So apparently the guy who owned the boat dropped them off and said, "You can't have my food." And he pulled out into the harbor, and he's going to sail back, but maybe not right away, because he has to wait for better weather. Yea, it was muttered by some that if they got not a place in time, they would turn them and their goods ashore and leave them. Let it also be considered what weak hopes of supply and succor they left behind them, that might bear up their minds in this sad condition and trials they were under, and they could not but be very small. It is true indeed, the affections of the love of their brethren at Leyden was cordial and entire towards them, but they had little power to help o'er themselves, and how the case stood between them and the merchants at their coming away hath already been declared. Okay, so they're left. They have to find a place to be left on the land, and the guy in the ship isn't going to give them much food. Okay. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, "Our fathers were Englishmen, which came over this great ocean, and were ready to perish in this wilderness? But they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice, and looked on their adversity. Let them therefore praise." So he is attributing the fact that they were saved, he's attributing it to God. Praise the Lord, because He is good, and His mercies endure forever. Yea, let them which have been redeemed from the Lord show how He hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor, when they wandered in the desert, wilderness out of the way, and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty. Their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord His loving kindness and His wonderful works before the sons of men. And now they're going to talk about starving, because they landed here with no food. Let's look at the questions again. What difficulties did the first settlers encounter from nature? Well, they talked about the fact that it was wilderness and it was winter and they had no place to hide. And Bradford uses evidence to attribute their survival to God. Right? He says that God provides for them. And now we're looking for an episode during that first desperate winter that illustrates the Puritans' concern for each other. And then how were they treated by the natives in their early encounters? And in what ways did the natives and settlers promise to help each other? Okay, so let's see if that's what happens next. The starving time. But that which was most sad and lamentable was that in 2 or 3 months' time, half of their company died, especially in January and February, being the depth of winter, and the wanting of houses and other comfort, being infected with the scurvy, and other diseases which this long voyage and their inaccommodated condition had brought upon them. Scurvy is a vitamin C deficiency, where if you eat lemons and limes, you'll be fine, but they didn't know that yet. So as there died sometimes 2 or 3 of a day in their foresaid time, that of 100 odd persons scarce 50 remained. And of these, in the time of the most distress, there was but 6 or 7 sound persons, who, in their great commendations, be it spoken, spared no pains, neither night or day, but with the abundance of toil and hazard of their own health, fetched them wood, made them fires, dressed them meat, made their beds, washed their loathsome clothes, clothed and unclothed them. In a word, did all the homely and necessary offices for them which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure, to hear named. And as all this willingly and cheerfully, without any grudging in the least, showed therein their true love unto their friends and brethren, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. 2 of the 7 were Mr. William Brewster there, about to turn the column, but you notice that they're starving and freezing and sick. But the people that are able to move take care of the people that are sick. And I will pause for a second. Do you have any questions? Yeah. Let me pause this recording here. See if I can pause it. There's a way to pause it, but I can't seem to do it. Yeah. What's the question? Yes. Right. Reverend Elder and Miles Standish, their captain, military commander, unto whom myself and many others were much beholden in our low and sick condition. And yet the Lord so upheld these persons as this general calamity, they were not at all infected either with sickness or lameness. So there is another example of God, okay, taking care of them because he kept these people well. And what I have said of these, I may say of many others who died in this general visitation, others yet living, that whilst they had their health, yea, or any strength continuing, they were not wanting to any that had need of them. And I doubt not by their recompense is with the Lord. Okay, so these people took care of each other, and of course, they're going to heaven. But I may not here pass by any other remarkable passage not to be forgotten, as this is the calamity fell among the passengers that were to be left here to plant, and were hasted ashore and made to drink water, that the seamen might have the more beer. And one in his sickness desiring but a small can of beer, it was answered that if he were his own father he should have none. Now, in our modern concept, we're thinking the beer is, drinking to have a party or something like that. But in that case, it would actually be nourishing because beer was made of grain. So it would have more nourishment and more calories than drinking water. The disease began to fall amongst them also, as for half of their company died before they went away, and many of their officers and lustiest men, as the boatswain, the gunner, 3 quartermasters, the cook, and others, at which the master was something strucken and sent to the sick ashore, and told the governor he should send for beer for them, that they had need of it, though he drunk water homeward bound. But now amongst his company there was far another kind of carriage in this misery than amongst the passengers, for they that before had been boon companions in drinking and jollity in the time of their health and welfare, began now to desert one another in this calamity, saying they would not hazard their lives for them. They should be infected by coming to help them in their cabins, and so after it came to lie by it, would do little or nothing for them. If they died, let them. So apparently, the story was different on the ship. The sailors were not taking care of each other the way that the Puritan settlers were taking care of themselves. Let them die. But such of the passengers as were yet aboard showed them what mercy they could, which made some of their hearts relent, as the boatswain and some others, who was a proud young man, and would often curse and scoff at the passengers. But when he grew weak, they had compassion on him and helped him, And then he confessed he did not deserve it at their hands. He had abused them in word and deed. "Oh," said he, "you, I now see, show your love like Christians indeed one to another, but let one another lie and die like dogs." Another lay cursing his wife, saying, as if he had not been for her, he had never come on this unlucky voyage. And another cursing his fellows, saying he had done this and that for some of them. He had spent so much amongst them, and they were now weary of him, and did not help him, having need. Another gave his companion all he had if he died to help him in his weakness. He went and got a little spice and made him a mess of meat once or twice, and because he died not so soon as he expected, he went amongst his fellows and swore the rogue would cozen him. He would see him choked before he made him any more meat, and yet the poor fellow died before morning. So the sailors were not quite as good to each other. All right, let's look at the questions. Um, we are about to get to the natives and their early encounters. All this while the Indians came skulking about them, and would sometimes show themselves aloof off. But when any approached near them, they would run away, and once they stole away their tools where they had been at work and were gone to dinner. But about the 16th of March, a certain Indian came boldly amongst them, and I'm going to read this word Indian. I hope it's not offensive. It is an old term. It was probably inappropriate. Um, but these Native Americans came boldly amongst them and spoke to them in broken English, which they could well understand but marveled at. At length they understood by discourse with him that he was not of these parts. So the natives had been in touch with the Europeans and had actually learned some English. Long to the eastern parts where some English ships came to fish, with whom he was acquainted and could name sundry of them by their names, amongst whom he had got his language. He became profitable to them in acquainting them with the many things concerning the state of the country in the eastern parts where he lived, which was afterwards profitable unto them, and also of the people here, of their names, number, and strength, of their situation and distance from this place, and who was chief amongst them. His name was, okay, this guy that helped him out, Squanto, told him where to hunt and fish and where the other people were. All right. So the natives apparently were normally running off, but eventually helped them out. His name was Samoset. He told them also of another Indian whose name was Squanto, a native of this place who had been in England and could speak better English than himself. Being after some time of entertainment and gifts dismissed, a while after he came again, and 5 more with him, and they brought again all the tools that were stolen away before, and made way for the coming of the great sachem called Myosuit, who, after 4 or 5 days after, came with the chief of his friends and other attendants with the aforesaid Squanto, with whom, after friendly entertainment and some gifts given, they made peace with him, which hath now continued this 24 years, in these terms. So these natives came, gave them back the tools, showed them how to fish, hunt and fish, showed them where, um, what was in the forest, and they gave them these terms. All right, and here it goes. In what ways did the natives and settlers promise to help each other? And then choose one of the peace terms. Were the peace terms more favorable to the settlers or the natives, or why? So let's see. Here are the terms of peace: that neither he nor any of his should injure or do hurt to any of their people. That if any of his did hurt to any of theirs, he should send the offender, that they might punish him. So this is the he is the native chief, and he's making these promises to the Europeans that if anything were taken away from any of theirs, he should cause it to be restored, and they should do the like to his. If any did unjustly war against him, they would aid him. If any did war against them, he should aid them. He should send to his neighbors confederates to certifying them of this, that they might not wrong them, but might likewise be comprised in their conditions of peace. So the native would send to all of his other neighbors, and they would all have peace with the settlers. That when their men came to them, they should leave their bows and arrows behind. So when the natives came to visit the Europeans, they wouldn't bring their weapons. So look at the terms of peace, decide whether or not they're better for the natives or the Europeans. Right, that'll be that question. And then two more questions. Where can you find evidence that Bradford thought America was divinely guided? And how would you compare Bradford's writing about Plymouth in the north to Smith's writing about Jamestown in the south? After these things, he returned to his place called Sowam, so 40 miles from this place, but Squanto continued with them and was their interpreter and was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. He directed them how to set their corn, where to take fish, and to notice the way that he says God intervened and sent Squanto to them, how to procure the commodities, and also was like their pilot to bring them to unknown places for their profit, and never left them till he died. So he was loyal all the way to the end. And then you're going to compare Bradford's writing about Plymouth in the north to Smith's writing about Jamestown in the south. Notice how much more straightforward that Bradford's writing about the north is, and how much less description of the violence there is, how much more factual it is, even though it is opinionated also. He certainly has opinions about the natives, but being a European of that era, um, especially coming from feudal England, he believed that the English were of a more civilized nature. And of course, being a Puritan, he believed that his people were sent there by God. Um, so compare the more straightforward writing of Bradford in Plymouth in the north to the southern writing of Smith about Jamestown in the south. Okay, and we're done. So I will turn off